In the last course section, we worked on this course project here. In this course section, we are going to continue working on this project, but we will focus on one specific aspect, and that's authentication. We will add users, real users, to this application. To be precise, we'll make sure that you can log in and sign up, and that you then can become a coach once you are signed up. Therefore, in this module, we'll explore how authentication actually works in Vue Apps and which steps we need to take to make it work. We'll then, as I just said, add login, sign up, and log out. And we'll also add a check to keep users logged in if they logged in the past and then leave the page and then come back. So plenty of things to cover. Let's dive right in. Before we write any code, we have to understand how authentication works in Vue Apps, or to be precise, in any single page application. Because it's a bit different than the traditional authentication you might know from websites and web applications where you use some server-side language. We're not doing this here. Vue runs in the browser, therefore this will work a bit differently. So we have our Vue app or any single page application using any library or framework, doesn't have to be Vue, and we got our backend server. In our case, that's Firebase, but it could be any HTTP server to which we send requests, any REST API or GraphQL API. Now, the thing is that on this server, we have certain public resources, but also some restricted resources. For example, in our course project, we might be able to get coaches and send messages to coaches without being logged in. So that would be public data and public resources, which should be accessible by any visitor of this web page, no matter if you are logged in or not. But then we also got some resources, some data, some kinds of requests that should be restricted. For example, you should only be able to register as a coach and therefore create a new coach if you are logged in. The same for fetching requests, fetching messages you as a coach received. Of course, you need to be logged in to do that. So we got mixed data on our server, and that's a typical scenario. In most websites, you will have some data that should be accessible by anyone and some data that's restricted. Now, the thing is, with this setup where our web application, our website, is kind of detached from the backend, it's not served by the same server, and the backend doesn't really know the front end. In such scenarios, the server really does not care about the clients, so about the Vue application in this case. The server, in our case Firebase, but again you could be using any API, really does not care about our Vue app. It doesn't store any information about that app. It doesn't store whether the user of this app instance is actually logged in or not. Therefore, we'll have to find a way of still keeping track whether the visitor of the web page who's currently using the website is logged in or not. Now, of course, it always all starts by some login data being sent from the Vue app to the server. We have some login page in our Vue app, and once the user entered an email address and a password, that data is sent to the server to create the user or to log the user in. And now on traditional websites, the server would basically store a session. It would store information about that user and just send a session ID to the front end, to the browser, so that there is a connection between the user using the site in the browser and the server being aware of that user. However, that's not how it'll work here when you have a single page application talking to an API. Instead, here, the server doesn't store any information and it'll do something else. It'll send back a token back to the front end, back to the single page application, in our case, back to the Vue app, once that login data is validated and verified. So if it is a valid user who's trying to log in, if that data could be confirmed by the server generates a token, which is in the end just a very long string, which is sent back to the client. Now, the thing about this token is that it's created such that only the server is able to validate it. Only the server will be able to tell if a token is valid or not, because it was generated with a certain secret key which only the server knows. So this token can't be faked. The token is then sent back to the client, and there we can store it. We can store it in Vuex or also in more permanent places like local storage. And the thing with that token now is that it can be attached to these outgoing requests to restricted resources. And if that token is attached, since only the server is able to validate the token, if the server receives a request to a restricted resource with a valid token, the server will grant access and return the appropriate data. If the token is invalid or missing, access is denied. That's how authentication works in single-page applications talking to an API, and that's exactly the setup we have here, and exactly the setup you will have in most Vue applications you're going to build. Therefore, this is the scenario we'll have a look at in this module. Now, of course, in our app, we also want to have some implications of the user being logged in or not on our web page itself, not just on the requests that are being sent. For example, this requests menu item should only be clickable if the user is logged in. We should only be able to register as a coach with the button that is sometimes visible here if we are logged in. Otherwise, we want to offer a login button to the user. So these are also implications of authentication being added to the app. And with that theory out of the way, let's now step by step add authentication and see all of that in action. So to add authentication, I will first of all ensure that Firebase doesn't grant access to all resources. At the moment it does that because in the real-time database which we're using, under rules we started in this test mode where we in the end allow reading and writing to all resources that are exposed by Firebase. And that's definitely not the idea here. We definitely don't want to do that anymore. Instead, only some resources should be accessible by anyone, and other resources should be protected. For example, in our app here, the list of coaches here and sending a message to a coach, that should be available to everyone. On the other hand, viewing the requests here and then also signing up as a coach, that should only be available to logged in users. And we can tweak the Firebase rules to make sure that this is also reflected on the backend. Now, if you're not using Firebase, if you wrote your own API, for example with Node.js, you of course have to write the code to check this on your own on the backend. Here with Firebase and the real-time database, we can tweak those rules a little bit to control how read and write access is granted. So how does this work here with Firebase? In this rules object here, you see those read and write keys, and then that in the end is a value that resolves to true or false. Now we can rewrite these rules a bit. And for that, I'll quickly have a look at my data first. We have to keep in mind that we got coaches and requests. Now in the end, we want to allow reading of coaches to everyone, but saving a new coach, that should not be possible for everyone. And for the requests, sending, so saving a new request, should be available to everyone, but reading should be restricted. So therefore, in the rules here, we can dive into the rules object, and here we can actually add coaches, because we have a data node called coaches in our database. And now we can set up read and write rules for that part of the database. We can do the same here for requests, to set up read and write rules for requests. And then we can have general read and write rules that apply to the rest of our database. So, which rules do I want to have here? For the coaches, I want to make sure that any data in that data node can be read by anyone. And for that, we set the .read rule here to true. This makes sure that everyone has full read access. But write should be restricted. We can set this to false and then no one would be able to write, but I will actually set it to a string where I check if auth is not equal to null. Now, auth is a special variable available in the Firebase rules, which will be not null if we added a valid token to the request. As long as we don't send along any token, it will be null. So then this is null and then writing will be denied. Now I'm just showing you these rules here because it's not a Firebase course. If you plan on using Firebase for your own project, you can dive into the official Firebase docs to learn all about these rules. Now for requests, we have exactly the opposite. Read is denied if we're not authenticated, but writing is actually possible for everyone. And these are very simple, trivial rules, which you could definitely refine a bit more. Now we can get rid of these general read and write rules here, and then publish our new rules. If we do that and go back to our application, we can reload the coaches page and that works. But on requests, we now get an error because we failed to fetch our requests, and we get back a 401 error. Unauthorized, because now Firebase is blocking access here. It's not allowing us to fetch requests because of our new rules. The same would happen if we tried to register as a coach. If I send some data here, you see we also get back the 401 response here. We don't have error handling in the app, which is why we don't see a modal here, but that request clearly failed. Now we updated the data on the front end here, because that's how our app currently works, but if I reload, you see that data isn't really there. Now, of course, these are all things we're going to fix throughout this module. Now, last but not least, if I try to send a message, that should succeed. We can view it in Firebase, in data. If we go to requests, we see there we have a new message, the message I just sent, because writing to messages is something we allow. So with that, we tweaked Firebase, and now we need such a token. And for that, we first of all need a way of letting the user log in and sign up. So let's add a sign up and log in page, then send that data to Firebase in exchange for a token, and then thereafter work with that token. So time to add a sign up page. For that, here under pages, I will add a new subfolder, auth, and in there add the user auth.view file, which will hold our user authentication form. And as I just said it, in here I want to have a form, a very simple form, where we maybe have a div with a class of form control. And then inside of that div, we have a label for the email field where we say email. And below that, we have an input of type email where the user should enter his or her email address. So I have an ID of email here. And then we can copy that to do the same for the password. So here we have type password, ID password, and we say password on the label. And below that, we have the base button where we say log in. And the caption of this button should change depending whether we want to log in or not, because I'll add a second button here where I set the type to button so that this button won't submit the surrounding form, where I say sign up instead, and where I set the mode to flat. This will ensure that this allows us to switch between signing up and logging in. Now for some styling, I think we can reuse the styling we find on another page, the contact coach page. Here we can grab the styling defined here. I don't grab the errors and don't grab the actions because I'm not using this here. And simply add styling to this component now. And yes, we could try to set this up as general app-wide styling or create separate components that hold inputs, but I will just copy those styles here and repeat the styling code a little bit. And one thing I forgot, I also want to put all of that into a base card component here for some nice styling. Okay, now that's the basic user auth page. Let's now bring it to the screen so that we can fine-tune it. And it should be loaded as a route. So in the router.js file, we can register a new route, maybe here, right before our catch-all route, which is /auth, let's say, where the component is this newly added component. So we import user auth from /pages/auth user auth.view. That's the component we just added here. And now user auth is the component that should be loaded when we visit /auth. So with that added, if we now enter /auth, and of course we'll soon add navigation options to get there, this is this component. Now one thing I want to change here in the styling, the form shouldn't have this border, doesn't need the border radius. We can get rid of that. Now this looks better. And actually, I will also swap this and move the form into the base card and not the other way around. Yeah, this now looks better. So now we got this form. This button will submit the form. This button will later help us switch between signing up and logging in, because of course this form should be able to handle both. And speaking of that, let's maybe continue with this form right away. And let's make sure that we do gather some user data and that we do send this to Firebase thereafter. So for that, back in the user auth component, we of course need a script. And we got some data we want to manage here. Because, for example, we want to manage the user input. That will be an email address and that will be a password. Now you can also add more complex validation, as we did it in the coach registration component, in the coach form to be precise. You could do this here in user auth, but we practiced this before. Here I want to focus just on authentication, so I will only add very basic validation here. For example, I will add a form is valid key, which initially is true, and will set that to false if the user submits the form and email or password should be invalid. We also need to be able to switch between sign up and login mode, because that will change which action will be dispatched later, which HTTP request should be sent. So therefore, I will also add a mode data property here and set this to login initially, but this can also be sign up once we added the logic. And that's the next thing. Let's add some methods. Submit form is one method. Switch auth mode is another method. Submit form, well, you guess it, should be triggered when the form is submitted. Switch auth mode should be triggered when this switch button here is clicked. So we can already wire this up. Wire up this second button and point at switch auth mode. And on the form, add the submit event handler with the prevent modifier and point at submit form. Also, connect the inputs with vModel and connect this one to email and the second one to password. With that done, we can start with submit form and check if this email is empty. And actually, therefore, I want to use the trim modifier again to trim any excess whitespace. So check if email is then empty, or if not, this email includes an @ symbol, which is a very trivial validation of whether we have an email address or not. Or if this password length is smaller than 6 characters, I think that's the minimum Firebase actually wants. If any of these conditions is met, then we set form is valid to false and we return so that no other code executes. And we set form is valid to true initially when the form is submitted to clear any errors we might be displaying. Because we can now use form is valid to show an error message, maybe here in a paragraph with vif, check if form is valid, or if it's not valid, to be precise, and then show a message of please enter a valid email and password, must be at least 6 characters long. So now we got this as well. And that's the basic validation I want to do here. Now, if we make it past this if check, we will then send an appropriate HTTP request for logging in or signing up, but that will be the next step. First, let's work on the auth mode. And here I want to check if this mode is equal to login. So if we are currently in login mode, in that case, I'll set mode to sign up. Else, if we are in sign up, I'll set mode to log in. And now we can use this mode data property to control what's displayed on the button here as a caption, but then also to later change which kind of HTTP request is sent here. Now, to change the button captions, I will use computed properties to keep that logic in the script here. And here I'll have the submit button caption and the switch mode button caption computed property. And on the submit button, I want to check if this mode is equal to login. And if that's the case, I'll return a caption of login. Else, we are in sign up mode, I will say sign up. And for the switch mode button, I'll basically do the same. I will also check in which mode we are. And if we are in login mode, I'll say sign up instead, because that's the new mode this button should toggle. If we are in sign up mode, I'll say login instead. And now we can use these computed properties here. So here on the submit button, I output my submit button caption with interpolation. And here on the switch button, I output my switch mode button caption. Okay. Now we can click the switch button and we switch between those modes. But at the moment, this of course only affects what we see on the screen. But that's better than nothing. Now, as a next step, we need to really get that user input and then send that data to Firebase to exchange it for a token or to create a new user to start with. Now, in order to use that entered data and create a user on Firebase or get such a token, we need to go to the Firebase console and there to authentication. And here you need to set up a sign-in method. You can also do this here under the sign-in method tab. And here we want to go with email password and enable this. Only this first one. Click save. And now Firebase supports creating users with email password. And of course, it also supports logging those in. Now, if you Google for Firebase Auth REST API, you also find the Firebase docs for the REST API they offer for creating users and signing users in. The two endpoints here are interesting. Sign up with email password, sign in with email password. This only works once you enabled authentication in your project though. So these are the endpoints to which we now want to send requests from inside our Vue app to create a user and get a token or log a user in. Before we send that though, we can write some code here because I don't want to send the request from inside this component, but again I want to use Vuex because it will also be Vuex in which we later need to store that token and store the information whether the user is logged in or not, because that login mode in which we are will affect what we want to display on the page here, for example in the navigation. So we need that as app-wide state. Now for this, we can create a new module, the auth module, or we manage this as a root state in our main store object, so to say. Now I will go for a separate module, the auth module, and in there add an index.js file, mutations.js, actions.js, and getters.js. So what we did before as well. And in our main store module here, I will then import the auth module from /modules auth index.js and add it here under a auth key. Now here's one thing which I won't do. I will not namespace the auth module for one simple reason, because in the past I managed my user ID here as a global state. And I don't want to change all the code all over the application where I use this user ID getter, for example. So I will now take that getter and remove it from here, but by not namespacing this module, when that module is added to our root store, all the getters and so on are still accessible as before, and therefore we don't need to change any other code. So with that, however, I will grab this getter object here, remove it and remove the getters key here, and go to my getters.js file in the auth folder and export that object. And grab the state here, this entire state actually, cut it as well, and add this to index.js. Here I export a default object, and here I'll bring in that state. And here we then also import mutations from mutations.js, import actions from actions.js, and of course also import getters from getters.js, and add all those things to this auth module object. So add mutations, actions, and getters using these JavaScript shorthands. And now we just need to export empty objects in actions and mutations. We got our getter and getters. And with that, we now are using that auth module. Here, I now want to define actions for logging in and signing up. And of course, all the mutations that will be committed once that's succeeded. Now let's start with the actions. Here I'll add a login action and also already a sign up action. And we have to start with sign up actually, of course, because we first need to create a user before we can log in. Here we get this context object and a payload. And now here I want to send a HTTP request to this Firebase auth REST API to sign up with email and password. So to this URL. So let's grab this URL here and use the fetch function to send a request to that URL. And actually this URL wants an API key, which is unique per Firebase application. So in your Firebase project, you can click on this gear icon, project settings, and then grab this web API key. Now you can't use mine because this project will already be disabled when you're viewing this, but grab your key in your project. And once you got that, enter it here instead of this square bracket API key square bracket thing. This is required for the request to succeed later. Now this sends a request to sign a new user up. However, just like this, it would send a GET request, and if we have a look at the docs, we see instead it should be a POST request. We also see which data needs to be added to the request, email and password, and then this return secure token key, which should always be true. Okay, so let's add this second argument, this configuration object for the request, set the method to POST, and also set the body to a JSON stringified object, which has an email field, which we should get from our payload, a password field, which I also expect to get on the payload, and this return secure token field, which should always be true. And this should send a request that creates a new user. Now, as always, fetch returns a promise, and therefore we can either use then and define the code we want to execute once this is done in the function we pass to then. Or we use this alternative way of using async await, which I'm doing here, so that we can await the response, and then the next line only executes once that response is there. And here I get that response data by awaiting response.json. And then we can also check if the response is maybe not okay, in which case I want to construct an error, a new error, where I look into my response data and see if I got a message there. And otherwise, I will set this to failed to authenticate. And then I throw this error. And if we make it past this if check, we should have a valid response and authentication should have succeeded. Actually, I will also console log response data here so that we see what's in a response if it's not okay. So which kind of data we get back from Firebase then. So if we make it past this if check, we succeeded. And now we want to see what's in the response data in the success case. Actually, we don't even need to guess because we see it here in the response payload documentation. We will get back an ID token, which is this token I mentioned on the slide. We get back an email, a refresh token, which we don't need here, information on when that token expires. For security reasons, it doesn't live forever. You could refresh it with the refresh token, but that's advanced and we're not going to cover it here. And you get back local ID, which is the user ID of the newly created user. And there are at least 3 interesting pieces of information here. The token, which we will need later to send requests to restricted resources. The expires in information, so that we know how long that token is valid. And the user ID. So in the mutation, which we should create here, I want to store all that data in Vuex. I'll name the mutation setUser because it's not tied to signing up or logging in. Here we get that data back for signing up, but if we check for signing in, so for logging in, we see it's pretty much the same information. So therefore, I'll have the same mutation. And here I get my state and also a payload. And I want to set state token equal to payload dot token, set state user ID equal to payload dot user ID, and set state token expiration equal to payload token expiration. So this assumes that we get a payload that has these 3 fields when this mutation is committed. Now we want to commit setUser here in our action. There with context commit, we want to commit setUser, and now we need to pass an appropriate payload object, which has token, user ID, and token expiration fields. So back in our action, here in this object, I'll set token equal to response data dot ID token, because it's the ID token field on the response that holds that token. And it's a local ID for the user ID, so therefore I'll set the user ID field on the payload we pass to the mutation to response data dot local ID. Now regarding the token expiration, for the moment I'll just set this to response data dot expires in, but we'll change this later. We will only need this later, so for the moment it doesn't matter too much. Now we set these 3 fields in this mutation, and therefore in the initial state I also want to set them. Initially, let's say user ID is null, token is null, and token expiration also is null. Now with that we prepared the action and mutation. Now we can go back to the user auth page and dispatch this action when this form is submitted and we have valid input here. So then I want to check if this mode is equal to login, in which case the login action should be dispatched, which we don't support yet. But else we have the sign up mode. I want to dispatch this store with dispatch sign up. Since the module isn't namespaced, we don't need to add any namespace here. This will dispatch the sign up action, and of course we need to pass some payload to this action, because on this action we expect to get the email and password on the payload. So therefore here we should set email equal to this email, to the entered email in this component, and password to this password. Okay, if we now save that and we go back, if we go to sign up instead and we try to submit this in an empty way, we get our error. Also, if we are just missing the password. But if the data here is valid and we try this, we don't get any visual feedback at the moment, but we get this response, which looks pretty good. It's an object with all that data I described, with the local ID and so on. And on Firebase, if we refresh this users page under authentication, we should also see that user here. Now, if I try creating the same user again, we'll see that we get an error. And that's the response data we got back from Firebase in an error case, where we have a nested error object with a message of email exists. And we can utilize this in our action for better error handling thereafter, but that's actually the next step, because I also want to show a loading spinner whilst we are submitting, for example. But the main takeaway is that it generally works. So now let's work on the feedback we give the user before we then take the next steps and also make login work and then use that token. So let's work on the feedback we're providing to the user, both in the error case as well as whilst we're waiting for the request to be sent. Now, in our action, the sign up action, I'm using async await. Therefore, as you learned already, this always returns a promise. Sometimes it returns a promise that fails, for example, if we throw this manual error. So with that, we can go back to user auth and there add two new keys to the data we're managing here. Is loading, which is false initially, and error, which is null initially. And in submit form, if we make it past the validation step, I'll set this is loading to true. And then once we're done dispatching here, I'll set this is loading to false. Now for that, we need to wait for this action to finish though. Otherwise, we set this instantly to false after this has been dispatched without waiting for the response. And therefore, I'll turn this into an async function as well, an async method, submit form, and we can then await this dispatching action. In addition, we can wrap this all with try catch, this if block here, so that we catch any error that might be thrown. And we can then set this error equal to error.message or to a fallback message of failed to authenticate, try later, anything like that. You can, of course, also fine-tune the error message you're throwing here inside of your action. Check your login data, for example. But you can also be more specific, for example, by drilling into that response object you get back from Firebase. Here you can really fine-tune this to your requirements. But with that, back in user auth, we try catch this, we set the error. Now we just need to reflect the loading state and the error on the user interface. And I will do that with help of my base dialog. I'll add a base dialog here and wrap this all into a div so that we don't have multiple root level components, because as you learned, that's not something the transition component wants. But then I have a base dialog here where I actually want to show a loading spinner. And therefore, I'll use this fixed prop, which we also have on the base dialog. You might remember that I talked about that when I added the base dialog component. It ensures that the dialog can't be dismissed. And I'll bind show to is loading. As long as we're loading, this dialog will be shown. And inside of that dialog, I then have a paragraph where I say authenticating. And below that, I show my base spinner. And I'll add another base dialog, which I want to show in the error case. By the way, on this other dialog, I'll first of all also set a title, where I also say authenticating. I guess we can then get rid of the paragraph though. So let's get rid of that, just show the spinner and say authenticating in the title. But now back to the other dialog. Here, I want to show this if we do have an error. So with this double exclamation mark trick, I ensure that this truthy or falsy value is converted to a Boolean. Can set the title here to an error occurred. And then inside of that dialog, I add a paragraph where I output my error message like this. With that added, if we saved it all and go back, go to sign up mode, and I enter the same email address as before, and I click sign up, we see that spinner and then that error dialog. This missing doesn't work at the moment, as I can see, because obviously we should listen to the close event on that error dialog, not on the other one, because the loading dialog is dismissed automatically, but the error dialog should be dismissed by us with a handle error method we should add, in which we simply reset our error data property. So here I'll add handle error in the methods of this component and set this error back to null. With that, it's a falsy value, and then this will no longer show the dialog. So with that, back in the app, if I again try this with an email I already used, we fail. If I use a valid email for signing up, we succeed. So that works now. We got that visual feedback. We also might want to redirect the user thereafter, but that's also something I'll focus on later. Because what I want to do at the moment is also make login work and then do something with the token. Thanks to our mutation, we are storing the token in Vuex. And that means that, of course, we can also access it from anywhere in this app whenever we need it. And I mentioned that we would need to add that token to outgoing requests if these requests target endpoints, resources on Firebase that are protected. So, therefore, we probably should add some getters here in our auth module. A token getter, for example, where we simply return state token. And now we can use this in the other modules when we send requests to protected URLs. For example, for coaches under actions, when we register a coach. Here, this resource is currently not accessible if we're not authenticated. Well, that's something we can change. If you send a request to your Firebase real-time database, you can add an auth token by adding a query parameter to this URL. That's something you can read in the official Firebase docs. Here we can add the auth query parameter after a question mark at the end of this URL and set the value equal to our token, because that token is just a string in the end. So now here we need our token, of course, so we can get that by accessing context getters token, just like that. And then we can add our token to this URL. With that, registering should be possible. We already are also using our user ID, which is now a real user ID generated by Firebase, so that's now also an improvement. Now for requests under actions, it's fetch requests which doesn't work if we don't have a token. So here we'll do the same thing. Get our token with context. Actually, we should use root getters dot token, and also under coaches, that should be root getters, because we access this on our root store, not on this module specifically, but on our root store. So context root getters token it is. And then add that token here as well with question mark auth equals plus token. Now with that, if we save all of that, if I go to requests and reload, we still fail because we're not logged in yet. At the moment, we need to log in manually all the time. We'll soon change this though. But let's go back to /auth by entering this and then log in. And then go to requests. And now you see we don't find any messages for us, which makes sense, but we don't get an error. If I go to all coaches, I can also register as a coach now. And if I give this a try, I'm a web developer and freelancer. Let me boost your career. And I click register. This also seems to work. And if I reload now, this data is still there because it now ended up in the real-time database on Firebase. Here under coaches, we now see that real user ID as a node for the coach data I just added. So that's great. With that, we now successfully attach the token to outgoing requests, which is a huge step forward. Now we can start working on the UI a little bit. For example, at the moment, we manually have to enter /auth to reach this page. Would be nicer if we had an option here in the navigation, or maybe here instead of register as coach. If we need to be logged in order to register, we should probably not even show this button if we're not logged in. So as a next step, we're going to update that UI. So for updating the UI, I got two main areas, and that's this register as coach button, which I want to replace if we're not logged in. And requests also shouldn't be visible here if we're not logged in. Instead, maybe we want to show a login button. For that, I will start in my getters in the auth module though. So there in getters, I'll add a new getter is authenticated. And here I want to check if we are authenticated. And how can we tell whether we are authenticated or not? Well, if we got a token, then we are authenticated. Because we start without one, and I will later reset it once we added a logout functionality. So if we have a token, we are authenticated. So I will return state token and convert this to a true Boolean by adding the double exclamation mark again. Now we can use the isAuthenticated getter in the different parts of this app. For example, under coaches list. Here we have this register as coach button, and that should not be visible if we're not even logged in. Instead, I want to show a login button or link instead. So therefore, we can add a new computed property here to coaches list. The is logged in computed property, for example, where I return this store getters is authenticated. Since this module is not namespaced, we can access the getter just like this. Now we can use is logged in and only show this register as coach button if we're not a coach, we're not loading, and we are logged in. So if we are logged in and we're not a coach and we're not loading, then I want to show this button. And of course, you could also put this all into one computed property to take this logic out of the template. Now I will add a new base button here, which will act as a link to /auth, where I say log in if we are not logged in. So if we're not logged in, this button will be shown. Now with that saved, here we see the login button. And we click it, we go to the login page. Now for the navigation bar. That's the header in the layout folder under components. And here we now also need to add a script to add a computed property to get access to our getters. I will also add a isLoggedIn getter or computed property here and return this store getters is authenticated. That getter we added a couple of minutes ago. And now only show this list item with the requests link if we are logged in. Otherwise, I'll show a different list item with a router link to /auth, where I say login. With that, if we save this, we now see login here as a navigation item. If I do log in, you see we have requests instead. And on all coaches, we would see the register as coach button if we wouldn't be registered already. So now let's also add a logout button and a logout functionality and check a couple of other things we can do here on our front end. Now to add a logout functionality, here in the header, I'll add another list item with a base button in it, where I say logout. Gives us this button. And this button should do just what it says. It should log us out. Of course, this list item should only be visible if we are logged in, because it makes no sense to show a logout button if we aren't logged in. And now we need to add a new action, and that's the logout action. So here in the auth module in the actions file, I add a logout action, and now logging out is really trivial. We don't need to send any request, because you might remember that I said that the server doesn't store any information about us anyways. So there's no need to send a request. Instead, the only thing we gotta do is clear all that data here, set it back to null. Hence, we get our state, and we can simply set state token equal to null, state user ID and set this equal to null, and state token expiration and set this to null. And that's all we gotta do. Now, since we, for example, check in our isAuthenticated getter whether we have a token, this will set isAuthenticated to false once we set the token to null, because that then is an invalid token. Now, of course, though that's not the valid way of doing it, that's an action, not a mutation, we got a mutation set user already, and in the end here we are setting the free fields which we want to reset, so we just need to pass a payload with null values for all those fields. So in the logout action, we actually get the context, not the state, but then here we should simply context commit, set user, and pass in our payload object where token is null, user ID is null, and token expiration is null, for the same reason as just explained. That's now the proper way of doing it. And with that action added, back in the header, we can add a click listener to this logout button, and in our script then add methods and add a logout method where we reach out to our store and dispatch this logout action. And now this logout method can be connected to this button. And if we do this, once this reloads, we can log in, let's say with test2 user, like this. Now on all coaches, we also see the register as coach button because this user isn't registered yet. We can go to requests and we can click logout and we see that updates. Now, one thing that doesn't update, neither when we log out nor when we log in, is the page on which we are. Now, if we do log in, it would be nice if we would be redirected back to the coaches page, for example. If we do log out and I'm on requests, it maybe would be nice, since I can't technically go to requests anymore, if I also would be redirected somewhere else. So let's work on that routing and redirection part next. So let's tackle routing. As mentioned, it would be nice to be redirected after logging in or after logging out. So the trivial way of doing that is the following. Here on the auth page, once we're done with logging in, so here inside of the try block though, not if we failed, but inside of try, so if we didn't get an error and these actions were done, then we can reach out to this router and use replace to navigate away, replace instead of push, so that we can't go back, because if we just logged in, going back to the login page doesn't make a lot of sense. And here we can then go to /coaches, for example. Now, something similar can be done when we log out. In the header, here, when we click log out, besides dispatching, we can redirect to /coaches or to /auth, wherever you want to go. I'll go to coaches. Now, that's a simple way of redirecting. Now, if I do log in here, and I log in, I'm on the all coaches page. If I log out and let's say I go to requests first, I also go to coaches. Okay, so that works, but that's only the simple way of doing it. Because what if I visit all coaches, I'm not logged in, and I click this login button here. Now, actually what I wanted to do here is probably register as a coach. We can make this clearer by going to the coaches list and say log in to register as coach. With that text on the button, if I reload, it should be clear what we want to do here. So here, after being logged in, I probably want to redirect not to the all coaches page, but to the registration page. And that's also something we can easily implement with Vue. For this, on coaches list, here, when we link to the auth page on the log into register button, we can add a query parameter. We can do this on local URLs, which are resolved by the Vue router as well. And for example, add a redirect key, though that key is totally up to you. It can also just be read. We are going to parse it in a minute, so it's up to you. So I'll name it redirect and say register here. Now with that set, if I click on this button, you see now we have this query parameter in the URL. And now on the auth page, we can check for this query parameter. And if we do have it, we can redirect the user somewhere else than our default, which is coaches. So for that here, once we did log in or sign up, we can get our redirect URL by accessing this route, query, that's a field we can access there, redirect. And now this here, this property you access on query has to be the query parameter you are using here. I'm using redirect here, so I want to access redirect here. That's my redirect URL then. And actually, I'll add a leading slash in front of that so that I go to slash and then whatever is stored in redirect, which in my case is register. And that should then lead to this register route. That's my idea. Now, actually, of course, we might not always have a redirect URL. And therefore here, I will simply wrap this in brackets and either use that or use coaches. So this line of code will construct a string, which is either slash and whatever is stored in the redirect query parameter or slash coaches. And then here we can redirect to our redirect URL, which we construct like that. With that, if we now save this, if I do log in with that query parameter set, you see I go to the registration page thereafter. If on the other hand I clicked just on login and therefore I have no query parameter, I go to the coaches page. And that, I would argue, is at least a little bit of a better user experience. Now, it's not the only thing I want to do when it comes to routing, though, because redirecting is nice, but we have a problem. If I'm not logged in, I can't go to the registration page. There is no button that takes me there, but of course we can manually enter /register and end up there. Sure, we will not be able to submit the data here, but it would be better to not even let the user go to this page if he or she is not authenticated. And we can use navigation guards to prevent this. You might remember, I talked about navigation guards in the routing module. Now we actually need them in this concrete project to enhance the user experience. In router.js, we can register a global navigation guard that is triggered before any navigation. We can attach navigation guards to individual routes. We can also attach them to components. I talk about that in the routing module of this course, so check that out for more details. Here, I'm going to use I think pretty elegant approach of using a global navigation guard, which still only affects certain routes and components. Now, to create such a global navigation guard, we use our router, and then here we can call before each and define a function that is executed before every navigation. And here we got this to, from, next thing. We got these three parameters. Now I will use route metadata, which I also covered in the routing module, to add special metadata to the routes that should be protected. That would be the registration and the requests routes here. And actually also the auth route, because here I want to make sure that we can't visit it if we are logged in. Because if we are logged in, going to the auth page makes no sense. So we can add this meta key to these route configs, and then add any metadata of our choice. Here in this object, I will set requires auth to true. And I will do the same here for the requests route. And for the auth route, I'll add a requires unauth key and set this to true. Now these key names are totally up to you. These are just the names I will go with. And the other routes have no metadata attached to them. They don't have requires auth or requires unauth. Now we can use that metadata in this global navigation guard, because now we can simply analyze the route we're going to and check whether it has special metadata where we then want to run extra checks. So we can check if the route we're going to on its meta field has requires auth. If that's the case, I also want to check a second condition in conjunction with the first one. I want to check if the user is logged in. Now for that, we need to access our store though, our Vuex store, because we have that is authenticated information in the store. Well, the good thing is we cannot just access the store in components, we can also use it in any other JavaScript file. All we gotta do for that is we have to import it. We can import our store from the store folder and there the index.js file. And then on this store, we can access the getters and check the isAuthenticated getter, just like this. And this will yield true if the user is authenticated. So if we require auth and we are authenticated, we'll execute this code. Now that of course means that here I want to call next, because if we require auth and we are authenticated, everything is fine. More interesting is the scenario that we require auth and we're not authenticated. Hence the exclamation mark in front of this getter. Now I don't want to call next like this, but instead I want to redirect the user. I want to deny this navigation. For that we can pass false to next, then the navigation is cancelled, or we pass a new URL, a new location object to next. For example, /auth, to redirect the user to the auth page in case he or she is not authenticated and wanted to access a page that requires authentication. Now that's just one condition I want to check. Another condition with else if is that the page we want to go to has the requires unauth field, which would be the case for the auth route. Then we have a problem if we are authenticated. So if this is true now, if we should not be authenticated, but we are, then I want to go to, let's say, /coaches instead of /auth. And only in the else case, we allow the navigation and continue as planned. And now we have a global navigation guard, which still takes route-specific settings into account. Now I'm not using the from argument here, so I'll replace that with an underscore. And if we now save that, we can give this a try. If I reload on the auth page, that works. If I try to visit the register page, I'm redirected to auth instead. If I try to visit /coaches, that works. If I try to visit /requests, that does not work, and I'm back on auth. Now if I do auth here, now we can move around, but I can't really test the auth case so that I'm authenticated and I want to visit /auth, because if we enter this manually in the URL, at the moment we lose all stored authentication status anyways, and therefore we are considered as logged out. Because at the moment I'm only storing auth information in Vuex, and whenever we enter something in the URL and hit enter, we restart the Vue app in the end, and that clears all the Vuex data. So we can't test this scenario, but we see that for register and for requests we are redirected, so our logic here seems to work as intended. And that's a navigation guard in action. Now, whilst we implemented navigation guards, I already brought up one problem. Whenever we manually enter a URL, we lose all our authentication data. That of course also means that if we leave this page and we come back later, even if we logged in 5 minutes ago, we will have to log in again. Because every time this page is reloaded, we start a new Vue application with a new Vuex store, and therefore all the data we had in the Vuex store before is lost. That's just how the browser and JavaScript works. But that does not mean that we can't store data which survives browser reloads. And therefore that's the next thing I want to do. I want to ensure that users can stay logged in. For that, we first of all need to go to our auth action and restructure the code here a little bit. We got the login and the sign up actions and the logout actions. I will add a new action, auth, which gets a context. And now I will actually refactor the other two actions so that we don't have as much code duplication, because I will now add even more code that would be duplicated otherwise. So I will grab this code from login and copy it and add it here in the new auth action. Get rid of console log, we don't need that anymore. And here I now just expect that on the payload, which I get here, I also get the mode, log in or sign up. So maybe a mode key on the payload. And then we got the URL, which is a variable, which by default, let's say, is that login URL here. But if mode is equal to sign up, then I want to replace URL with the sign up URL, which we can grab here from the sign up action. Copy it and add it here. And the idea here is that we now simply can use URL here in the actual fetch function, and we set URL appropriately before. And the rest of the code then is the same anyways. So here we don't really need to differentiate. Now I also want to use async here so that this still returns a promise, and we can use the await keyword. So auth should be async. And now we can go to the login action and get rid of all that code and instead use context dispatch to dispatch the auth action here from inside the login action and pass on an object where I first of all copy my existing payload by using the spread operator, hence spreading, copying all the key value pairs of payload into this new object, which is passed as a payload to the auth action. And then I add mode and set this to log in here, because we need that mode key in the auth action. And then we can copy that and do the same for sign up. And here set mode to sign up. Now, important, we want to return the result of dispatching so that this promise, which is returned by auth, is in the end also returned by login and sign up, so that our components can still keep track of whether we are still waiting for a response, whether we got an error, and so on. With that changed, if I go to login, let's quickly test this. This is still looking good. So looks like we still are able to send these requests. Yeah, that's looking good. Signing up with a user that already exists fails. So now I refactored this, and I did this for a very good reason. Because now we have to store that data, the token, the local ID, and now, or at least soon, also the expiration, not just in Vuex. We do need it there, but not just, but also in some storage that survives page reloads. And a great example here would be local storage, which is an API built into the browser. So it's some browser storage which we can access from inside JavaScript. For that here, before I commit set user, I will access local storage just like this. It's available in the browser. And then call set item to store new data in local storage. And here in the end, I want to store my token, which I get from response data.id token. And I also want to store the user ID, which I get from response data local ID. So now we don't just commit it to Vuex, but we also store it in the browser storage. And I'm doing this so that we then also can add an action where we check for this data when the app starts, and when that data is available, we automatically log the user in. Because at the moment, if I save that, if we reload this app, if I log in, it still works as before, and when I reload, that state is lost. But now, if you go to the DevTools of your browser, and there to application, in Chrome at least, you can visit the local storage, you can view that, and in here you will see a user ID and a token field. And that's that data which I just stored. And now we can use that to log the user in. By the way, we can view that data, but it's also our data. So that's no problem. It belongs to us as a user. So now we can add a new action, auto login or try login, whatever you want to name it, where we do just that. We check whether that data exists, and if it does, we set a user. If it doesn't, we don't. So here we also get context, and then we can access local storage and get an item, the token, store that in a token constant, also get the user ID, and then check if we got a token and a user ID, let's say. Then I want to context commit set user and pass that data on. So here, pass that payload to set user, where I set the token to the token we extracted from local storage, and set the user ID to the user ID we extracted from local storage, and set token expiration to null at the moment because we're not using it yet. That will change soon. And if we don't have a token or we don't have a user ID, this will not be committed and we will not set the user. We will not log the user in automatically, so to say. With that, however, we now need to dispatch this action whenever our app starts to check whether we can log the user in automatically. And the best place to do that is the app view file, because that is our root component. This gets created first when the entire app starts up. So here we can add the created lifecycle hook, which is fired when this component is created. And there we can then reach out to our store and dispatch the try login action. And with that, if we save this, you see if I now reload, I actually end up in logged in mode. And I can even reload on requests and we stay on that page. So now logging the user in automatically works. The only thing we now gotta take care of is that we clear the data if we log out, because at the moment if I then reload, I'm logged in again, because I don't clear the data in local storage. And we also should log the user out automatically when the token expires, because it turns out that the token has a limited lifetime for security reasons. So let's start with logging the user out and clearing the data. For that, in the logout action, besides committing this, we should also reach out to local storage and remove the token and also remove the user ID. Now that was the easy part. The more tricky part is that we want to log the user out automatically if the token expired. And for that we got this token expiration, which we aren't really using at the moment though. Now when we do log in here, like this, in the data which we get back from Firebase, as you can see in their docs, we also get the expires in field, which is a text but actually holds the number of seconds in which the ID token expires. I can tell you by default that will be 3600 seconds, which is an hour. Now we want to store that expiration date, not the duration because that doesn't help us, but the expiration date in the future when the token becomes invalid whenever we do log the user in. So here in our auth action where we send the request, when we store that data in local storage, we now also want to derive the expiration date, which is a date in the future, which is the current date plus the amount of seconds until the token expires. So for that, we can get the current date by calling new date. That gives us the current timestamp. But now I want to add something here. And actually for that, I will call getTime to get the current timestamp in milliseconds. And I want to add the expiration time, the expiration duration in milliseconds. So for that, I'll add expires in and get that from response data dot expires in times 1000. And ensure that this is converted to a number by adding a plus here. So that is then converting the string to a number. Then, since this is in seconds, I multiply it with 1000 to have it in milliseconds. And then I can add expires in here to expiration date to have a new expiration timestamp in milliseconds, which will be in the future. Current time plus that duration. And it's this expiration date which now also has to be stored in local storage. So here I set a new item, which is the expiration, which is called token expiration, which is that expiration date. And here we now also store that in UX, the expiration date. Actually, we don't even need it in UX because local storage is enough. It only matters to us when we reload the page. So we don't need to commit it here. And in the mutation, we can actually also get rid of it here. And in try login, we therefore also don't need to set this anymore. Instead, now we store it in local storage, but I want to do one other key thing. I want to set a timer whenever the user is logged in so that we automatically log the user out if that timer expires. And that's something I will also do here in the auth actions. I will set a new timeout here where I have my expires in, so this time in milliseconds, as a duration, and after that duration, this function will execute. And in this function, I will simply dispatch the logout action because that's what I want to do if the token expires. I also want to make sure that I only have one timer active at a time. So I will actually add a global variable here, timer, which I use to hold my timer like this. And then we can use this timer variable from anywhere in this file to clear the timer. And I want to clear it whenever we log out. When we log out, I want to call clear timeout and pass this timer variable to it to clear the ongoing timer. For example, if we manually clicked the logout button, then I also want to clear the logout timer. I also, of course, want to remove the token expiration item from local storage if we do log out. and also not commit this anymore because we don't store token expiration in Vuex anymore. So now we got this timer set whenever we logged in here. We also need to set this timer when we automatically log in. Then we need to check how much expiration time is left and set a new timer to that time. So that's why I'm storing token expiration in local storage. So here I can get my token expiration by accessing local storage get item, token expiration. And that will now be a timestamp in the future. So we now need to get the difference between that timestamp and the current time, which I'll again store in a constant named expires in, which is that token expiration converted to a number by adding a plus minus the current time as a timestamp in milliseconds. So that will then be the difference in milliseconds between this time in the future, when the token expires, and the current time. And of course, if expires in should be negative here, then we don't even need to log the user in. We could even argue that if it's smaller than, let's say, 10,000, so smaller than 10 seconds, that even then logging the user in makes no sense. But I will go with smaller 0 here. And if expires in is smaller than that, then the token is definitely invalid. So then in that case, I will just return here and not continue with logging the user in, because the timer expired, there is no need to continue here. Otherwise though, if the timer is positive, if we have enough time left, if the token is still valid, I again will set a timer here with expires in as a duration. And just as on my other timer, in this function, I'll call context dispatch logout and store that timer in the timer variable. Okay, so theoretically that should work. In order to test it, I will manually tweak this expiration time a bit. And when we log in, I will not set it to the actual expiration duration which we have, but instead I'll duplicate this and comment out the correct one and just set it to 5 seconds. So now after 5 seconds we should be logged out. So if we give this a try and reload and log in here, that works, but after 5 seconds we shouldn't be logged in anymore. And that looks good. The UI switched to not logged in state. That should also work if I reload the page in between. So if I reload, I'm still logged in, but still, this should then update, and it does. Now, one problem we have with this solution can be seen if I visit a protected page like requests. If I'm logged out, I now stay on this page. So we should ensure that we redirect the user if we automatically log the user out. And to achieve this redirecting upon auto logout, I will add a new action, which I name auto logout, where I get my context and where I will dispatch the regular logout, but where in addition, I will also commit another mutation which we have yet to add, which I'll name did logout. And in this mutation, did logout, I'll set a new state, did logout, to true. And that's some state we first of all want to add to our main state here in the auth index.js file. Did logout initially is false. Maybe name it did auto logout to be clearer. I will also name it did auto logout here when I update it, and name the mutation did auto logout. Maybe also name it set auto logout to be in line with the other mutation. And then in actions dispatch set auto logout. Now what's my idea here with that auto logout thing which I now set? That should be set when the auto logout action is dispatched. So now in the timer, I want to dispatch auto logout here and also in the other place where I create the timer. And the idea is that now in app view, we can add a watcher and watch this auto logout. For that, we just need to add a getter, did auto logout, where we get our state, where we return state dot did auto logout. So that state which I'm setting in this mutation, returned by this getter. And in app view, we can then add a computed property, did auto logout, where I return this store getters did auto logout. And then we can watch this did auto logout computed property, receive the new value or the current value and the old value. And we can now check if current value is true. So if we did auto logout and current value is not the same as the previous value, so it did change and it is now true, then we can use the router to redirect to /coaches, let's say. With that, when we automatically log the user out, we redirect to coaches. So if we now give this a try, and we are on /requests, we are redirected to coaches. So now with that, that would be one way I can think of that should help us redirect the user here. Now with that auto logout approach and this mutation where I changed it auto logout, I also want to make sure that I change this if we log in again. So if we set a user again, then did auto logout is set to false again, so that the next time it switches to true, we also trigger this watcher again. This watcher will then run if it's true and changed, and therefore we need to change it back, otherwise it would never change again. I also noticed that, of course, now here in index.js of the auth module, we can get rid of the token expiration here because we're not really using it in our Vuex state, but that's just a side note. With that, we get the auto logout functionality added, and therefore in the auth actions, I want to switch back that expires in time to the real time, which is of course longer than 5 seconds. So that now if we log in, we actually should stay logged in and we can interact with this application and, for example, send a message to another coach, or also send a message to ourselves. Hi there, which we now can also see under requests. So that's now auto log in, so that we can reload and stay logged in, and auto log out added to this application. And therefore, we now added all the key building blocks which you need to add authentication to a Vue app. So in this module, we added authentication to this application. With that, we can sign up and log in. And you saw all the different pieces that you can add to an application to, well, add authentication. We used Vuex for the different actions and for sending the HTTP requests. And we also used it to manage the login and logout status and to also log the user in and out automatically, for example, when the token expired or after a page reload. Now, these are some of the key features which you will most likely need in any application you're building. Here I'm using Firebase as a dummy backend, but the general idea is always the same. If it's your own backend, if it's an API, which it typically will be, it will definitely also send back some kind of token which you need to store and which you need to manage and which you need to attach to outgoing requests. So therefore, what we did in this module does not just apply to Firebase, but with slight variations, of course, to any backend you might be connecting to any Vue app. Therefore, I hope it was helpful, and I hope all these core concepts are clear and understandable.